Number 5. In 1974, a man by the name of Gerald Turner became known as the infamous Halloween Killer. His only victim, a 9-year-old Lisa French, was assaulted and murdered on Halloween night in 1973, paving way for the local community to ban trick-or-treating for years to come. Lisa French was a nearby neighbor to Turner. At around 6 p.m. on Halloween night, she left her home and eventually made her way to Turner's doorstep, where she found that his door was left open. She yelled trick or treat, though received no answer. After a moment, she decided to leave and head to the next house, though Turner surprised the girl, snatching her into his home where he immediately assaulted her, ultimately strangling her to death. He then stashed her body into 2 separate garbage bags, eventually tossing them out of his car window just outside of town. Following this, a 4-day investigation and search for Lisa began, which involved an incredible 1,500 volunteers. Though it ended up being a lone farmer who discovered Lisa's body, which had been tossed just along the edge of his property. He notified police, and the body was quickly confirmed to be Lisa. In mid-1974, police began to investigate neighbors of Lisa's, eventually making their way to Turner's home. At this point, police noted a strange feeling about Turner, believing that his story simply didn't add up. They eventually asked him to take a lie detector test, which he agreed to, though the results were apparently inaccurate. Following this, as well as further interrogation, Turner eventually confessed to his crimes. He was sent to trial and was sentenced to 38 years in prison for his actions. It's widely reported that Turner was not well received in prison, and was noted as being at the very bottom of the inmate pecking order. While in prison, Turner was caught attempting to smuggle in violent pornographic material to his cell. This didn't go over well with the guards and other inmates, prompting the guards to take the magazine. Though Turner eventually sued the guards as well as the governor for this. Strangely, Turner won the case and was allowed to keep the magazine. He was then paroled in 1992, though his parole officer found even more violent pornographic material on his home computer, which broke the rules of Turner's parole. Following this, Turner was sentenced to an additional 15 years in prison. No one is sure exactly where Turner is today, though it's believed that he's likely a free man. Number 4. On Halloween night in 1963, an elderly woman by the name of Catherine Armstrong was found battered to death in her home, with no clues as to who the murderer was. Police found her body after responding to a call that the old woman's curtains remained drawn, and there was no answer to repeated knocking at her door. They then broke down the door and entered the home to find Catherine, fully clothed in a robe and slippers, dead in her living room floor. She was found to have been stabbed at least 28 times and had defensive wounds on her hands. The crime was so brutal and unexpected that numerous police employee vacations had to be canceled, and additional help from officers had to be called in from surrounding areas in an attempt to locate the killer. Catherine had just recently retired from her job at a local junior high school and was a regular churchgoer and choir singer, the last person you'd ever expect to be murdered in this fashion. Because of this, detectives decided to focus most of their efforts into piecing together the last 16 hours of Catherine's life, in hope of shedding some light onto what may have gotten her killed. Police began interviewing people in the area and were eventually informed that 2 children had seen Catherine alive around 6:30 p.m., watching out of her window. Though she was expected to arrive at choir practice around 7:30 but never arrived. This left a 1-hour window in which she must have been killed. Following this discovery, police began to suspect that teenagers may have been responsible for the woman's murder, or possibly even a recently released inmate who had been incarcerated for a similar crime, though both of these assumptions were quickly ruled out. Police eventually interviewed some 16,000 people by January of 1964, and were still working 18 hours a day on the case, though they eventually admitted that they had no idea who committed this crime. To this day, the murder still remains unsolved, and depending on the age of the murderer, it's very possible that he or she may still be among us. Number 3. Late into the evening of October 31st, 1957, beauty shop owner Peter Fabiano along with his wife Betty were turning out the lights of their home, heading to bed, when the doorbell rang. Mr. Fabiano headed back downstairs, believing it to be a late trick-or-treater. Mrs. Fabiano states that she heard him open the door and ask, "Isn't it late for this sort of thing?" just before hearing a loud pop followed by a thud. Mrs. Fabiano ran downstairs to find her husband lying on the floor bleeding from a gunshot wound to the chest. She says she called for help, but her husband ultimately died on the way to the hospital. It took police nearly 2 weeks to identify a single suspect in the case, though they eventually tracked down a woman by the name of Joanne Rabel, who had previously worked with Mr. Fabiano at his beauty shop. Rabel had apparently become a close friend with Mrs. Fabiano, and the two even lived together for a short time when the Fabianos were having marriage problems. According to Mrs. Fabiano, following this separation, Mr. Fabiano decided he wanted to try to work things out with his wife, though he had one condition. She was to never speak of Rabel's name in his presence and was never to see her again. These requests led many to believe that Rabel and Mrs. Fabiano had likely been having an affair, though this has never been confirmed. Eventually, Rabel was arrested under the suspicion that she had killed Mr. Fabiano out of jealousy, though she denied any involvement, claiming that she had been home the night that he was killed. As there was no hard evidence to tie Rabel to the murder, police had no choice but to let her go. Just a month later, police received a tip that a lockbox had been found inside of a department store that should be checked into. When officials arrived and searched the box, they found a .38 caliber pistol, which is later confirmed to have been the gun that killed Mr. Fabiano. After tracing the gun's origins, it was determined to have belonged to a woman named Goldine Pizer, who was a lab tech at a children's hospital. Pizer was reported to have been a very shy woman and almost immediately confessed to the murder. However, she insisted that it was not her fault, instead casting the blame on a supposed spell that had been placed on her by Joanne Rabel. The two women had apparently been great friends for many years leading up to the attack, and many speculate that they may have had a romantic relationship. Apparently, Rabel's hatred for Mr. Fabiano was an extremely common topic between the two women. It eventually led Rabel to convince Pizer to buy a gun so that they could kill him. In the end, Rabel pled not guilty to the crime, and Pizer pled insanity, though the two were both eventually sent to prison for life on second-degree murder charges. Number 2. Dean Corll was an American serial killer, also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper, due to the fact that his family ran a local candy store. Dean is known to have taken the lives of at least 28 young boys in the 1970s, with the help of 2 teen accomplices, who would assist in luring the children to Dean's home. His victims were usually lured in by offering them a free ride or offering to take them to a party. In one instance, on Halloween night, Dean offered a poisoned pixie stick candy to a young boy, which he ate and subsequently died from hours later. Though his victims would more commonly be restrained in some form and later killed by suffocation or gunshot. He would bury the bodies of his victims in a shed or a heavily wooded area. Dean Corll is considered by many to be the worst serial killer America has ever known. Dean's victims were all between the ages of 13 and 20, though the majority of them were in their mid-teens. He most often abducted them from the Houston Heights area, which is a low-income portion of the city. It was here that he met with 2 of his accomplices, Elmer Henley and David Brooks. Many of Dean's victims were friends of the 2 boys, making their abductions fairly simple. Dean would lure the victims into the back of his Ford Econoline van, then drive them to his house. It was here that he would keep the boys for a few days before ultimately killing them. In several instances, it's known that he would force the boys to call their friends and family and tell them that they were safe, so as to avoid any unwanted search efforts. In 1971, David Brooks introduced Elmer Henley to Dean. It's believed that Elmer was intended to be another one of Dean's victims. However, Dean saw potential in Elmer and offered to let him live if he would help abduct other children. To further entice Elmer, he offered to pay him $200 for every child that he abducted, which was a huge amount of money at this time. Given that Elmer's family was in dire need of the money, he hesitantly accepted. This was an agreement that would later prove fatal for Dean. In August of 1973, Elmer brought a girl to Dean's house when he was not home. The girl was not intended to be a victim, though when Dean found out about this, he captured the girl and Elmer both and drugged them. After they had awoken, Elmer was instructed to kill the girl. At first, he seemed to be okay with this. However, he quickly changed his mind, grabbed Dean's gun, and aimed it towards him, screaming, "You've gone too far, Dean. I can't have you killing all of my friends." Dean stepped closer to Elmer, insisting that he shoot him, claiming that he wouldn't do it. However, he did. Elmer shot him 6 times, killing him where he stood. Elmer then released the girl as well as 1 other victim and phoned police. Elmer later faced trial and was sentenced to 6 life terms in prison for his crimes against the younger victims, though he was not charged for the death of Dean Corll. Number 1. On Halloween night in 2004, 3 young women were relaxing in their home located in Napa, California. Unexpectedly, there began a loud pounding at the door. One of the girls heard this commotion and fled the house, though the 2 others weren't as lucky. Without any further warning, a crazed man burst in the door of the home and began to stab one of the girls, named Adrienne Insona. Another girl named Leslie Massara witnessed this and attempted to flee, though she too was ultimately stabbed to death. The girl's friend, named Lauren Mienza, thankfully made it out of the home alive, though she arrived back just minutes later to find her roommates' bodies lifeless and bloodied in their bedroom. A brief investigation into the incident was held, at which time it was determined that one of the girl's friends was engaged. The friend's fiance was determined to have been the killer, and he was quickly sentenced to life in prison. The most terrifying part about this story is that no one knows exactly why this man felt the need to senselessly kill these young girls. In fact, he pled guilty to the actions in court, and even seems somewhat remorseful for his actions, though he's yet to state any sort of reasonable explanation for the killings. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep updated with our videos.